What's going on, everybody, and welcome to episode 93 of the Book Binge, where this week we cover another classic book, but this time being my first experience with Jack London. But no, I did not read The Call of the Wild. No, I did not read White Fang. I read The Seawolf. That was my first London experience, and I will tell you what, I don't think that should have been my first book by London, but either way, let's just kind of talk about the book. My experience with this was mostly mixed bag, all things considered, and you'll see if you can see the timestamps below, or if you're looking at the bar on YouTube. Yeah, it was definitely a mixed bag. It has some great high moments that I really enjoyed, but it also has some very boring and kind of mediocre at best moments as the low end. But let's just kind of talk about it generally speaking. I would say for the good, the bad, and the ugly, because all of this is kind of, it's all being kind of grouped into one section, because when it comes right down to it, I admittedly had a very tough time trying to review this book. I didn't even get a written review made for it, no matter how brief, for Goodreads, because I just never bothered. And every single time I went to make my notes for this video review of the book, I ended up, well, let's just say I ended up putting like 1 or 2 points down in one of the sections and then just kind of going to do something else or work on some other notes or writing my book or whatever the case may be. Like, I just never sat down and like worked on the notes for this book or for this review, because it just, it for whatever reason, I just felt very apathetic about it. That's really, really the case, because nearly everything that somebody could list in either the good or the bad portion of this book, like something that was really good or something that wasn't quite so good, could also be considered the exact opposite, whether by a different reader or just at a different point in the book. For example, there's some stuff that I really enjoyed in the beginning that wasn't quite as good at the end. There was some stuff that was pretty good at the end that, just wasn't done as good as it could have been, and therefore was a little disappointing, or whatever the case may be. It's just kind of a weird book in that sense. I would say the biggest issue that I had with The Seawolf is that it was a bit too long, actually, even though it's not necessarily a super long book. The Seawolf in this 3-book collection that I have takes up half the entire page count. So it's the length of The Call of the Wild and White Fang combined. And to be fair, neither of those two are long books, but I do think The Seawolf would have greatly benefited from being, say, the length of White Fang as opposed to the length that it was. It does have 3 separate sections. I wouldn't necessarily say it's 3 acts to the book, but there are like 3 different things that the book is doing. There's the very beginning of it, which is really kind of philosophical in nature and has kind of like this, philosophical discussion that underpins the entirety of that section between the main character and Wolf Larson, who I guess is the primary antagonist of the book. And that stuff was really interesting, but that's only like the first part of the book. Then it goes into like the second part of the book, which are tied together by those characters and kind of the sort of relationship dynamics that is formed between the main character and other characters, and how those all kind of go together, but it's more like a normal seafaring adventure. In a way that I wouldn't necessarily say I loved. I think that this second section here was probably my least favorite part of the book. And then it goes into a third section where there's kind of, how do I say this without necessarily spoiling it? I mean, it's really hard to say any of this without spoiling certain aspects of it, because the third part is just so different. You introduce a new character in the book, and then there's sort of a romance plot that is going on through most of this third section, and then parts of the third section as well kind of call back to the very first section between the main character and Wolf Larson. Kind of the philosophy and some of this stuff worked really well and was satisfying, and kind of tied itself in a bow, but some of the other random stuff that is thrown in between just doesn't work as well as I wish it did. It's almost as if the book just needed an editor to kind of guide it, or to focus it a little bit more, work on combining these different aspects in these different sections a little bit better, so that it felt more like a book rather than 3 different books that have the same characters and sort of themes going on that don't necessarily tie together the most smoothly. It's, I don't know, it's kind of confusing, I would say. I will say, though, the very first third of the book was probably my favorite by a very long shot because I would say, I don't know, first 20% of it, I think, maybe first 25% of it. I was reading the book and felt like it had to be some sort of deconstruction of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, which I really enjoyed, where a lot of the things that go on in 20,000 Leagues, just kind of threw out, I suppose. And then the very beginning of this book are like the exact same, but also opposite. So it felt like a deconstruction and then a reconstruction of a totally different way of viewing that sort of situation. I thought that that was really cool. But then it went into the second section that just did not do anything like that and actually decided that maybe there was sort of a plot going on to it. I think if the book was a lot shorter, if all of these sections were kind of condensed, well, if the second and third sections were kind of condensed and combined in a better that flowed more smoothly, and then the first part was able to wrap around all of that and also be a little bit longer, and the book was more focused on, say, the philosophical aspects of it, that would have been a lot better because those were really interesting. Just kind of the dichotomy between the main character and Wolf Larson. For example, Wolf Larson is a character that, in terms of his morals and his viewpoints, I could not disagree more with anything that he believes, pretty much that he expresses in this book, but I found it very interesting to listen to him talk about that. Well, listen to him talk about that, you know what I mean. But a lot of it just, I don't know, the book itself didn't float together. Not to mention one of the other issues that I had with it. Despite enjoying the first couple chapters were written in a way that, and kind of vaguely in a sense, that I genuinely thought that this book was also from a dog/wolf POV like Call of the Wild is, and I believe also White Fang is, correct me if I'm wrong, but that is absolutely not the case. But when it comes right down to it, the biggest thing that I think this book does wrong is that basically everything about it that is good or enjoyable also has aspects to it that aren't as good or enjoyable, and nearly everything about it that is overall not that great has points at which it is pretty good, even, say, like the romance plot, which I think is the part that most readers that I read this with were most underwhelmed by. That was the part that they thought didn't work as much. I enjoyed it more than I think most of them did. But for sure, like some of these weaker elements had moments that were good, but for the most part weren't as good. But then the better stuff, like the philosophy and Wolf Larson as a character, interacting with the main character, was really good for the most part, but also had moments where it was like, what in the world is Jack London doing? So the recommendation for this is very difficult for me because it's one of the most mixed bags of mixed bags I've ever read. I mean, I've said this about a couple books in the past, such as, say, actually, I can't come up with a specific example off the top of my head, but I have said this about a couple books in the past where it's like, well, I don't know whether to recommend this or not because there's parts that I loved, but there's also parts that I really didn't like. Or in another case, say like American Psycho, where it's just like, I loved this book, but I don't necessarily recommend it. This book is one of those that's just like, I simultaneously loved it, but also very much did not, depending on the section of the book that I was reading, and partly because it was just too long. I think the prose is pretty great throughout, so I suppose that's something that I should have thrown into that last section. I think the writing is really the only thing that holds this book all together in any way that I think works or is satisfying, generally speaking. So I kind of recommend it because the prose is great, and even though a lot of the stuff that it's doing simultaneously works and doesn't work, the reading experience is at least fairly smooth. But I also don't recommend it because I don't find the book particularly special. It's just kind of a very hard balance to strike. Generally, I think most people who read it enjoyed it more than they didn't enjoy it, and I think most people enjoyed it at least a little bit more than I did, for example. So if you're a fan of London already, if you've read some of his other stuff and you really like what you've read, I say give it a shot. But I don't necessarily recommend it as a first-time affair. Being my first Jack London novel, I'm not a fan of this book a whole lot, for sure. I'm definitely not turned off to him as an author. I know too many people who love London, just broadly speaking, in a way that's like, well, I'm definitely going to read more, and it would be kind of blasphemy to say I'm not going to read any more London without at least reading Call of the Wild and White Fang. But with that being said, I don't think The Sea Wolf is good as a first-time affair at all. Like, just don't make it your first London book. I do not recommend it for that at all. So this is probably a little bit more of a rough review and probably less guided than most of them are. because of the fact that I combined the good, the bad, and the ugly kind of all together and just kind of rambled rather than having specific points to make most of the time. So I apologize for that, but like I said at the beginning, it was a little bit because I was so apathetic to review this that I didn't even bother with a brief written version of it when I finished the book. And I was so apathetic to review it now that every time that I sat down to make notes, I would write down a couple things, erase things, rearrange stuff, and then just not get much done, generally speaking. And I didn't necessarily want to record this review, but I just knew that it was going to be a short one right after I just reviewed Eye of the World. And I was like, I might as well just get it over with before it comes to the weekend before it needs to come out, and I still don't want to review it. So, more or less, my feelings on the book as a whole was just kind of apathetic. There was stuff that I really enjoyed, but there was also stuff that I really didn't, that just kind of balanced in a way that I don't think worked overall for me. But with that being said, thank you guys for watching. I will be back on Thursday with another Wheel of Time diary. It should be, I think, my third one for The Great Hunt. I'm not entirely sure, but stick around next week for a review of Malice by John Gwynne. Thank you guys for watching. I'll be back in the next video.